Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so today we're doing a deep dive into something huge. We are objectively mapping out a massive, centuries-spanning narrative. We're going to look at the actual architecture of a hidden global power structure, literally piece by piece, exactly as it's been constructed by various political and historical texts over the last 2 centuries. We're unpacking how these specific authors claim a super secretive elite has, just quietly pulled the strings of world events from the shadows. Let's get right into it. All right, let's start by taking a look at Gary Allen's None Dare Call It Conspiracy. The core premise here really perfectly visually encapsulates the main argument shared by all the authors we're examining today. Just think about it. You take these seemingly totally opposing forces, right? The dollar sign representing capitalism, the hammer and sickle of communism, the peace sign, the clenched fist of revolution. Well, the overarching claim here is that these contradictory forces are actually entirely connected. The texts argue they are funded and manipulated by one unified hidden elite. Crazy, right? But that's the claim. So here is our roadmap for decoding this historical architecture. 1. The hidden hand hypothesis. 2. Origins, the Bavarian Illuminati. 3. Concentric circles of power. 4. Financing global revolutions. And finally, 5. Modern shadow networks. Let's keep moving. Part 1. The Hidden Hand Hypothesis, Coercion versus Freedom. To really wrap our heads around this architecture, we first need to look at how power is supposedly wielded. According to author Antony Sutton, the fundamental difference really just boils down to visibility. Think about it. Open organizations, they invite public discussion, they operate in the light, and they're intrinsically linked to freedom. But strict secrecy? Well, Sutton argues that secrecy is historically an absolute necessity for any group intending to violently overthrow political structures. It's basically the ultimate hallmark of coercion, an agenda that, let's be real, the general public would never willingly accept if they knew about it. Moving on to Part 2, Origins, the Bavarian Illuminati. So, if we want to find the supposed blueprint for all this hidden subversion, our source texts trace things all the way back to 18th century Europe. Authors like John Robison argue that the Bavarian Illuminati, which was founded in 1776 by Adam Weishaupt, well, it wasn't just some harmless social club. These texts claim it was actually a highly structured, incredibly strategic framework designed specifically to infiltrate institutions and ultimately overturn world governments and religions. It was allegedly the prototype. And the methods? They were incredibly specific. We're talking meticulously planned. Look at this 1778 letter. Weishaupt, who was actually using this super dramatic classical code name Spartacus, details his strategy. He explicitly states that science shall here be the lure for recruitment. He even mandated this intense system of auricular confession. Basically, members spied on one another. The whole point was to weed out religious prejudice and guarantee absolute, unquestioning loyalty to their anti-establishment goals. It was a completely closed loop of control. Which naturally brings up a pretty crucial logistical question, doesn't it? I mean, if these core societies are operating in absolute, strictly enforced secrecy, how does a totally hidden agenda actually translate into mainstream geopolitical action? How do they pull the levers of power without exposing the core members? Let's explore that in Part 3, Concentric Circles of Power. To answer exactly how they operate, modern authors have mapped out a very specific structural anatomy. Antony Sutton describes it brilliantly as a series of concentric circles. So picture this. At the very center, you have a completely hidden inner core and inner circle, something like Chapter 322 of Skull and Bones. This tiny, totally secret, invisible center basically casts a massive shadow over a much larger, highly visible outer circle. Now, this outer circle, what Sutton calls the penumbra, is made up of open, completely legal organizations you've almost certainly heard of. We're talking about the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, the Bilderbergers. But here is the kicker. The authors stress that these organizations aren't conspiracies themselves. Not at all. They are basically rich man's clubs or discussion forums. They provide a safe, totally respectable space where that hidden inner circle can quietly assess up-and-coming leaders and gently steer international relations without ever once revealing where the actual directives came from. Which brings us to Part 4, Financing Global Revolutions. Okay, so how does this actually translate into execution on the ground? How do these hidden elites allegedly finance massive, world-altering changes? Well, author William Guy Carr argues that history just repeats itself through a very deliberate, chronological blueprint. He claims that international bankers intentionally engineer regime changes and wars. And he maps it out, moving chronologically from the English Revolution in 1640 right through to the Great French Revolution in 1789, and ultimately culminating in the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917. Now, this is really where the texts make their most startling claim. By digging deep into State Department files and official biographies, authors like Cleon Skousen and Anthony Sutton argue that ultra-wealthy capitalist megabankers actively funded the exact communist revolutionaries who supposedly wanted to destroy capitalism. Just look at this data. For example, they cite Jacob Schiff allegedly providing a whopping $20 million to Trotsky and Lenin. The narrative argues that at this level, it's not about ideology at all. Actually, scratch that. Ideology is just a tool. The real point is simply about funding whichever faction will successfully destabilize the target nation so the hidden hand can consolidate power.
And finally, Part 5, Modern Shadow Networks.
Fast forward into the late 20th century, and we see how these texts claim this centuries-old architecture operates today. Books like Conspirators' Hierarchy allege that modern groups, like the Club of Rome, essentially dictate policy while hiding under the respectable cover of NATO. They even go as far as claiming that intelligence factions deliberately use labor unions as fronts. Why? To intentionally polarize workers and management. The goal here is to create continuous societal friction, just constant noise and conflict, that a hidden elite can step in to manage and ultimately control. As we conclude our mapping of these fascinating source materials, we're really left to ponder a rather provocative thought. Regardless of where you actually stand on the historical validity of these specific claims, you have to ask yourself, why do these narratives of a hidden global power structure remain so incredibly persistent across centuries of human history? Perhaps it speaks to a deep, enduring human desire to find deliberate order, intention, and let's be honest, a face to blame behind the often terrifying chaos of world events. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Catch you next time.